For nearly half a century, Fawlty Towers has been treated as untouchable, the gold standard of British sitcom writing. The show every comedy student is told to study frame by frame. Only 12 episodes were ever produced, and yet it managed to outlive shows that ran for a decade. But in the summer of 2020, something happened that no one saw coming. A broadcaster quietly pulled one of its most beloved episodes from the airwaves. No scandal involving the cast. No lawsuit. No leaked footage. Just a single scene, sitting inside a single episode, that suddenly felt impossible to defend in the modern world. The show that had survived critics, survived a shaky start, and survived even its own creator's divorce, found itself in the middle of a fight it never expected to have. So what was in that scene? And why, decades after it first aired, did it suddenly become the reason a network hit the delete button? To understand that moment, you have to go back much further than 2020, back to a rude hotelier, a busted briefcase, and a hotel in Torquay that nobody was ever supposed to remember. In 1970, John Cleese was just another member of the Monty Python troupe in England's seaside town of Torquay to film location work for Flying Circus. Along with the rest of the team, he checked into the Gleneagles Hotel expecting nothing more than a bed and a decent breakfast. What he got instead was a masterclass in hospitality gone catastrophically wrong, courtesy of the hotel's owner, a man named Donald Sinclair. Sinclair wasn't simply unhelpful. He was suspicious of his own guests to the point of paranoia. When Python member Eric Idle left his briefcase sitting in the lobby for a moment, Sinclair didn't ask around to find its owner. He picked it up and hurled it over the garden wall, apparently convinced it might be an explosive device. When Terry Gilliam held his cutlery in a way Sinclair found improper, he was publicly corrected as though he committed a serious offense. Complaints from guests were met not with apologies but with open irritation, as if the guests themselves were the inconvenience. Cleese found the whole experience bizarre, and also strangely fascinating. Here was a man who seemed constitutionally unfit to run a hotel, and yet ran one anyway, oblivious to how absurd he appeared to everyone around him. Cleese began quietly taking notes on Sinclair's behavior, not realizing at the time that he was collecting the raw material for one of the most enduring characters in television history. Years later, working alongside his then-wife and writing partner Connie Booth, Cleese transformed those notes into Basil Fawlty, a hotel manager whose barely restrained fury, social clumsiness, and talent for offending everyone in his path became the engine of an entire series. The tantrums were exaggerated for comic effect, but the foundation, the suspicion, the awkwardness, the desperate need for control, was pulled directly from Sinclair. Sinclair himself died in 1981, reportedly without ever realizing that a few disastrous days in his hotel had inspired a national comedy phenomenon. Long before any of that, John Cleese was a lanky, unusually tall schoolboy growing up in Weston-super-Mare, the only child of an insurance salesman who had changed the family surname from Cheese to Cleese years earlier, deciding it sounded more dignified. By his early teens, Cleese already towered over his classmates, and while his height made him stand out physically, it was his sense of humor that eventually defined him. His schooling at Clifton College gave him an early outlet for a very particular kind of comedy, dry, visual, and quietly rebellious. In one prank, he painted a trail of footprints leading away from a war memorial statue, as if the statue itself had simply wandered off. It was juvenile, but it was also a glimpse of the kind of absurdist storytelling he'd later build a career on. Not everything about his school years was light-hearted. Being passed over for a leadership position despite his academic record left a lasting impression on him, one that arguably shaped the skepticism toward authority figures that would later run through so much of his comedy. After a delay caused by a lack of university spots, Cleese spent time teaching Latin and other subjects at his old prep school before finally arriving at Downing College, Cambridge, to study law. It was there, almost by accident, that his path changed. At a student club fair, representatives from the university's famous Footlights comedy troupe asked if he could sing or dance. His blunt answer was no. He added that if there was anything worse than his dancing, it was his singing. When they asked what he could do instead, he said simply that he made people laugh. That answer got him into Footlights, where he met future collaborators including Graham Chapman, setting in motion the chain of events that would eventually lead to Monty Python, and much later, to Fawlty Towers. By the time Cleese sat down to actually write Fawlty Towers, he wasn't working alone. His writing partner was Connie Booth, an American actress he had married a few years earlier. Together, they took the disastrous week in Torquay and reshaped it into something far sharper than a simple bad hotel review story. They built an entire ecosystem around Basil, a sharp-tongued wife who could deflate him with a single glance, a level-headed maid who was often the only sane person in the building, and a well-meaning but perpetually confused Spanish waiter who turned every misunderstanding into chaos. The show's first episode aired on the BBC in 1975 to a surprisingly cold critical reception. Reviewers found the pacing frantic and the premise strange, unsure what to make of a sitcom built almost entirely around a man's escalating fury. Audiences, though, responded immediately. Word of mouth grew, reruns performed well, and what critics had dismissed as chaotic slowly came to be recognized as tightly, meticulously engineered farce. Behind the scenes, the story was more complicated. By the time production began on the second and final series in 1979, Cleese and Boo's marriage had ended. They continued working together as professionals despite the personal fallout, determined to finish what they'd started, and the result was some of the sharpest material the show ever produced. It would be the last project they ever worked on together. In total, only 12 episodes were made across the two series. Yet those 12 installments were enough to secure the show's reputation as one of the finest sitcoms Britain ever produced, eventually being named the greatest British television series of all time by the British Film Institute in the year 2000. Among those 12 episodes, one stood apart from the rest almost immediately, both for its audacity and for the argument it would still be causing decades later. Titled The Germans, it originally aired in October of 1975. The premise finds Basil recovering from a head injury just as a group of German tourists checks into the hotel. Desperate not to offend them, Basil issues a now famous instruction to his staff: under no circumstances should anyone mention the war. Naturally, within minutes is doing exactly that, spiraling into an increasingly frantic string of wartime references before capping it off with an exaggerated, goose-stepping impression of Adolf Hitler in front of his mortified guests. The scene became instantly iconic, one of the most quoted moments in British television history. Cleese's argument, then and now, was straightforward. The joke was never at the expense of the German guests. It was aimed squarely at Basil's own ignorance, his obsession with a war he clearly can't stop thinking about, and his complete inability to read a room. The German tourists in the episode are the reasonable ones. Basil is the fool. That distinction, Cleese has always maintained, was the entire point of the character. For years, that reading largely held. The Hitler impression drew occasional criticism, but it was broadly understood as satire aimed at British wartime obsession rather than an endorsement of anything ugly. What almost nobody focused on, at least not at first, was a much smaller, much quieter moment buried in the same episode. A brief exchange involving one of the hotel's recurring guests, an elderly retired army officer known as the Major. The Major is a minor character across the series, an old-fashioned relic prone to rambling stories nobody asked to hear. In The Germans, he tells a story about attending a cricket match, and in the course of that story, uses deeply offensive racial language to describe West Indian and Indian cricketers. It's a brief moment, easy to miss next to the loud spectacle of Basil's Hitler impression, and for decades it drew far less public attention than the goose-stepping scene that everyone remembered. That changed in June of 2020. In the wake of global protest following the death of George Floyd, broadcasters across the world began re-examining older content for language and imagery that no longer fit modern standards. UK TV, a streaming service owned by the BBC, announced it was temporarily pulling The Germans from its platform while it conducted a review. A spokesperson explained that the episode contained racial slurs, and that the company regularly reassessed older programming to account for the impact of outdated language. The removal made international headlines almost instantly. It wasn't just entertainment writers who noticed. The story was significant enough that a foreign head of government was asked about it directly at a press conference. For a show that had spent 4 to 5 years being treated as an almost sacred piece of British comedy history, being quietly yanked from a streaming library felt like an earthquake. John Cleese did not stay quiet. He publicly criticized the decision in strong terms, describing the network's handling of the situation as cowardly and accusing the BBC of being run by people more concerned with public relations than with understanding comedy. His central argument echoed what he'd said about the Hitler goose step decades earlier. The show was never endorsing the Major's views. It was mocking them. The character was written as an out-of-touch relic specifically so that audiences would laugh at how absurd and small-minded his opinions were, not so they'd nod along with them. Removing the episode entirely, in Cleese's view, punished the joke for correctly identifying its target. The backlash to the removal was almost as loud as the removal itself. Longtime fans accused UK TV of overcorrecting, arguing that satire aimed at prejudice was being treated identically to prejudice itself. Others pointed out that context and intent matter, and that a scene written to expose a character's ignorance shouldn't automatically be lumped in with content that celebrates it. Within days, UK TV reversed course. The episode was reinstated with an added content advisory warning viewers about offensive language and outdated attitudes, a solution similar to what other classic British comedies had already adopted for older material. It wasn't a full retreat, and it wasn't a full concession to critics either. It was a compromise that satisfied almost no one completely, which in hindsight might be the most fitting outcome an episode about miscommunication could possibly have had. What makes the 2020 controversy so interesting isn't just what was said or removed. It's what it revealed about how differently the same scene can land depending on when you're watching it. In 1975, critics fixated on the frantic pacing and the audacity of putting a Hitler impression on primetime television. In 2020, the conversation had shifted almost entirely toward a few lines from a supporting character that had barely registered as controversial for 4 to 5 years. That shift says less about the episode itself and more about how cultural sensitivities move over time. The scene didn't change. The audience did. And that's arguably the exact tension Fawlty Towers was built to explore in the first place. A man convinced he's in control, confidently marching forward, while the world around him quietly redefines the rules he thought he understood. Cleese has continued to defend the episode publicly in the years since, framing the entire debate as a case study in how satire is often misread once its original context fades. He's pointed out repeatedly that Basil and the Major are never portrayed as admirable. They are fools. Their prejudices and blind spots are the joke, not the message. Whether audiences today read it that way without the surrounding cultural memory of 1970s Britain is, understandably, a much harder question to answer. The controversy surrounding the Germans is only one small chapter in a much longer story. And the people who built that story went on to lead lives every bit as unpredictable as the show itself. John Cleese never really slowed down. He went on to co-write and star in A Fish Called Wanda, lent his voice to major animated films, and remained a fixture of British public life well into his 80s, still willing to weigh in loudly on modern comedy, censorship, and everything in between. In 2023, he announced plans to revive Fawlty Towers, co-writing the new version alongside his daughter, Camilla Cleese, a project that reignited exactly the kind of debate the original show had been having about itself for years. Can something built on 1970s sensibilities survive being reintroduced to a modern audience? Connie Booth took the opposite path. After the show wrapped, she stepped almost entirely out of public life and pursued a career in psychotherapy, leaving behind the spotlight that Cleese continued to embrace. Prunella Scales, who brought Sybil Fawlty's icy precision to life, went on to a long and respected acting career, though in recent years she has been living with vascular dementia, something her husband, actor Timothy West, has spoken about candidly and with visible tenderness. Andrew Sachs, who turned Manuel into one of British television's most beloved characters, endured genuine physical mishaps during filming, including an injury from a frying pan scene that was originally shot using a real pan before the production switched to a safer rubber prop. He continued acting for decades afterward before passing away in 2016. Ballard Berkeley, who played the Major at the center of the 2020 controversy, died in 1988, long before his character's dialogue would become the subject of an international news story. Nearly 50 years after it first aired, Fawlty Towers remains one of the most quoted, studied, and occasionally litigated pieces of British comedy ever produced. It survived a lukewarm critical reception at launch, survived the BBC nearly cancelling it after just 6 episodes, survived its creator's divorce mid-production, and survived becoming, for a few strange days in 2020, an unlikely flashpoint in a much larger global conversation about race, language, and how societies decide to handle uncomfortable pieces of their own cultural history. What the whole episode reveals, more than anything, is that comedy this sharp rarely ages quietly. A joke built entirely around exposing someone's ignorance depends on the audience recognizing that ignorance as the target. Strip away the context, and the same scene can suddenly look like something else entirely. That instability, the fact that the Germans can simultaneously be celebrated as some of the finest satire British television ever produced and criticized as a relic that needed a warning label, is exactly why it refuses to fade from the conversation. Basil Fawlty never once succeeded at anything he set out to do. Every plan collapsed, every attempt at control backfired spectacularly, and that was always the joke. Perhaps it's fitting, then, that even decades later, the show built around his failures is still causing exactly the kind of chaos and disagreement he himself would have caused if he'd been standing behind the front desk the whole time. So the question worth sitting with isn't really whether that scene should have been pulled, edited, or left untouched. It's whether comedy this old can be judged fairly by rules it was never written with in mind, and whether audiences today are laughing at the same joke Cleese and Booth were writing in 1975, or hearing something entirely different when they watch it now. There's also a broader pattern worth noticing here, one that extends well beyond a single hotel sitcom. Almost every classic British comedy from that era, from Till Death Us Do Part to Love Thy Neighbor to Dad's Army, has faced some version of the same reckoning as streaming platforms and archives make decades-old programming instantly accessible to audiences who never lived through the cultural moment that produced it. Jokes written to skewer a specific kind of small-minded Englishman suddenly get watched by viewers who have no memory of that archetype at all, and without that shared cultural shorthand, the satire can start to look uncomfortably close to the thing it was mocking. Fawlty Towers simply became the highest-profile example because of how beloved it already was. The bigger the reputation, the louder the argument over what to do with its rough edges. It's also worth remembering that this wasn't the first time the show had to defend itself, and it likely won't be the last. Long before streaming services existed, letters poured into the BBC after the Germans first aired, with some viewers accusing the show of trivializing a painful chapter of European history through the Hitler impression alone. Executives debated shelving the episode entirely before ultimately deciding to let it air. In other words, the show has been surviving versions of this exact fight since the week it was broadcast, only the specific scene under scrutiny has changed. Once, it was the goose step. Then it was the Major's cricket story. Perhaps the next reevaluation, whenever it comes, will focus on something else entirely, some line or gesture that audiences in 1975 barely blinked at and future viewers can't imagine getting a pass. That resilience, oddly enough, might be the clearest evidence of how well-constructed the show actually is. A weakest sitcom, one built on cheap shock value rather than genuine character work, likely wouldn't have survived even one of these controversies, let alone two, separated by 4 to 5 years. The fact that Fawlty Towers keeps getting pulled back into the spotlight, keeps getting defended, edited, reinstated, and argued over, suggests there's something underneath the joke sturdy enough to be worth fighting about in the first place. Very few sitcoms get remembered decades later at all. Fewer still get remembered well enough that people are still willing to go to war over how one specific scene should be handled. Whatever side of that argument a viewer lands on, one thing seems unlikely to change. Basil Fawlty is still going to march across that lobby, arms rigid at his sides, shouting at a group of bewildered German tourists, for as long as anyone keeps a copy of that episode running. The debate over whether he should be allowed to isn't going away either. If anything, the more the show gets re-examined, the more it proves the exact point Cleese has been making since 1975, that the joke was never really about the war or the cricket match, or even Germany at all. It was about a man so consumed by his own anxieties that he became a danger to everyone around him, including himself. Decades later, audiences are still arguing about the wrapping paper while the gift underneath, a portrait of blind, self-defeating arrogance, remains exactly as sharp and as uncomfortable as the day it first aired.